Well, professors do interesting things. And there was one who stood in front of the class one day and said, well, let me pose a question to you. And he went over to the corner table and he picked up a bottle. And the bottle had a live wriggling worm in it. And he took some alcohol and he poured it into the bottle. The worm died. Went over to the corner table, picked up another bottle with another live worm in it. Poured in some chocolate syrup. The worm died. Picked up yet a third bottle. Put in some tobacco ashes. And the worm died. And then he looked at his audience, his students, and said, what do you make of that? And one clever little boy in the back stood up and said, sir, I think if you drink, smoke, and eat chocolate, you don't have to worry about worms. Well, of course, he had made the right observation, but he came to the wrong conclusion. And coming to the wrong conclusion based upon observations is really what throws you off track. Well, we don't want that to happen, right? We want to be on the straight and narrow. And that, in fact, is what my office at McGill is dedicated to doing. We hope to shed light on confusing situations, especially in the world of science. And we have a mandate to try to educate the public and to demystify science for them. It's a challenging endeavor, for sure, but it also happens to be a great deal of fun. I'll share some of this with you. McGill decided, now about 12 years ago, that our job was not over the moment that our students passed through the rotted gates onto Schwarcz. Because today there's such hunger out there for scientific information that if it isn't fulfilled in a proper, unbiased fashion, then people will end up listening to whoever is standing on top of the tallest soapbox, yelling the loudest. And those usually are the quacks. They may not look like quacks these days. In fact, they may be dressed in the garb of science. And they may be spouting scientific-sounding words. But nevertheless, they are quacks and they do mislead. So our mandate really is to try to demystify science, to try to make sure that people are up to date on what happens in the world of science. We hope to foster critical thinking, separate sense from nonsense. If all of that works well, hopefully keep people out of the clutches of charlatans. We accept no biased funding whatsoever. All of our funding comes from the university, and therefore it is not our concern whether or not a substance like bisphenol A, something that I'll mention later on, is legalized or not. Our concern is that whatever decision is made is based upon proper scientific methodology, not upon emotion and not upon ideology. When our office was first started, I thought that we needed a logo. Everyone kind of likes to have a logo, specific to their endeavor. And I had a suggestion about what it should be. I thought that this one would be great. This really was the thrust of what we were going to do. No, we're not against eating meat, although I think we probably eat a bit too much of it in North America. No, that's not what we're against. What we're against is this commodity, which is becoming piled higher and deeper, and it is getting to be harder and harder to dig out from underneath it. But, of course, we try, and we mostly try to do that through sound education. Well, talking about this kind of nonsense that is out there and it's proliferating, how about people who try to tell us what is going to happen in the future? This is not something that is novel. Fortune tellers, predictors have been around since humanity has been around, endeavoring to tell the future in all kinds of ways. We would all love to know where we're going, right? And it is pretty neat to think about what the future may bring. However, thinking about it in terms of entrails of animal is a different kettle of fish. And yet this was one of the major ways that people try to predict the future, believe it or not. Millennia ago, they would cut open an animal, chickens, goats, look at the entrails, and, quote, read them to try to determine what the future would bring. Sounds pretty nonsensical, and of course it is. But this was not the only methodology that has been used. The reading of tea leaves. Very, very common in the Middle Ages. You gulp your tea, the leaves would be left behind, and the fortune teller would look at that. It never occurred to anyone to ask, how, why, what connection could there possibly be? How would those tea leaves know anything about what the future would bring? But there was more than that. Of course, palm readers are still around today telling us what future holds for us. And then there are the astrologers who look at the configuration of the planets and the stars and tell us what the future will bring. This is one of the oldest methods of trying to predict the future. Even today, there are people who believe in this, who believe that our future actually lies in the stars. Well, you would think that with everything that we know today, scientifically, that we would have overcome this kind of nonsense. But still, newspapers print astrology charts on a daily basis. If you look at these as a form of entertainment, the same way that you read the comics, fine. But when people look at these astrological charts and believe that there's actually something to these, that becomes a potentially dangerous situation. Because believing in one kind of nonsense usually leads to believing in other kinds of nonsense. One of the simplest ways, of course, to quote, prove that should do this because it's so absurd that it doesn't really require any proofs. But to show that astrology is nonsense is to just look at the different kinds of astrological predictions practiced by different astrologers around the world. They each have their own view of what the night sky looks like, and then they come to different conclusions based upon exactly the same evidence. People still believe. Believe it or not, President Reagan had an astrologer. President Reagan's astrologer, Joan Quigley, would advise the president on when to meet foreign leaders, on how to conduct affairs of the state. The President of the United States was getting advice from an astrologer. Defies belief. Even Bush didn't have anything like that. Where was our pal Joan Quigley during the 1989 earthquake in San Francisco? Smack in the middle of it, with her house collapsing around her. The astrologer who was telling the President of the U.S. how to conduct foreign policy did not know that her house would be collapsing due to an earthquake. Then we have Nostradamus, perhaps the most famous of the seers. Nostradamus actually was trained as a pharmacist, well, as much as you could be trained back in the 16th century, but that's not where his fame lies. His fame lies with having supposedly predicted the future with his famous quatrains in his prophecies. These were little poems that supposedly foretold the future. Well, did they? Hundreds and hundreds of books have been written on Nostradamus, many of them arguing that in fact he was correct, that he foretold the future. Until you really check into it. And the fact is that when you do the checking, there's absolutely no event that has ever been predicted based upon his prophecies. After an event, people will look at those prophecies and try to match it. The prophecies were written in archaic French. The translations are generally not very well done. And when they're translated in English, they're translated in such a way as to make the prophecies seem more realistic because the event has already occurred. But when academics look at all of this and look at the events and look at the predictions, there just is nothing there. We have modern day Nostradamus, like Sylvia Brown, perhaps the most famous of all the current psychics. She gets $800 for a half-an-hour telephone interview And you have to book her a year in advance, which is absolutely astounding because the woman is virtually wrong about everything that she presents. Now, sometimes it's amusing, but often it's very serious because when she tells concerned parents and grandparents that their child has been mistreated in some way, which is total fabrication, and the results turn out to be quite opposite, this is playing around with people's minds. This is an awful thing to do. She has told people that their child is dead when he was later found. This is an evil woman. I mean, I don't use that word loosely. This is what she is. She steals money from people, lies, and in many cases destroys their lives, pretending to know something about the future. Now, there are many fortune tellers out there who are quite clever. They're clever in a way that we call cold reading, where they will sit down with someone and very cleverly read their personality, ask some probing questions, and then spew back the information without the person even realizing that they gave the answer. So you can be very impressed until you listen to a tape of the performance, and then you see that what you thought really happened was not at all what happened. People will remember hits, they will forget misses. And what these people do is make all kinds of claims, some of which come true. And of course, those are the ones that people will remember. They'll tell you 100 things, one of them is true, 99 are total nonsense. You remember, of course, the one that is true. They're also very clever psychologists. They know what kind of events are likely to come true, and they will predict those. Most of the time, of course, people don't check predictions, but I do. Since the early 1990s, I've been keeping track of the major predictors, the seers. And what I can tell you is that I've noticed that they do have a talent for being wrong more than you would think they should be. They are wrong more often statistically than one would guess. Virtually nothing that they say comes true. Let's go back to 1993 when I started this business. White House shocker, the Clintons will split up. If anyone ever had motivation to split up, it was the Clintons. But of course it never happened. Paula Abdul never eloped with Arsenio Hall. Martina Navratilova never had John McEnroe's baby, or in fact, of course, anyone else's. Donald Trump did not have a fling with Barbara Walters, or if they did, they were very good at keeping it secret. And you can go through predictions like this, and you just find that it just doesn't come true. But should one ever occur, they will never let you forget that. How is it that the most epic moment in our lives, right, which of course was 9/11, was never predicted by any astrologer, any palmist, any tea leaf reader, anybody? The most important event that we've all lived through, never predicted. So I think that in itself is pretty much proof that there really is not much to predicting the future in this fashion. But there are some psychics who will say, oh yes, but it was predicted. How? With the famous 9/11 bill. Well, that is a US currency. I mean, that's legitimate money, this is true. And if you take this $20 bill and you fold it in a particular way, like this, right? It is pretty interesting. We'll admit that. Of course, what is most interesting here is that there are people who go around folding US currency to see what it will reveal about the future, right? Well, I suspect that this is a coincidence. Could I prove it? No. You can never prove a negative. You can't prove that something is not so. But I suspect that it is a coincidence. I don't think our future lies in US currency, not in this fashion in any way. But it's very interesting that someone actually did find that. It would have been a lot more interesting, though, if they had come out and said that this was going to happen before the event happened. That would have been really neat. If someone would have said, look, you know, I folded this currency and then look what this looks like, this is going to happen. Yeah, then I think we would have paid attention to this kind of business more. Well, what about using science to predict the future? You know, I think most of you will agree that what we've been chatting about up to now has been kind of fun. But can we, based upon what we already know, predict the future? The fact is that, no, we're not very good at that. You know, back in the 1950s, when I was growing up, you know what we thought the future would hold, what science fiction then was? Dick Tracy's radio watch. We thought that this would be the end all, to have a radio on your wrist. Did anybody, even the greatest scientific minds at that time, and this was not centuries ago, I mean this was, you know, 5 decades ago, did anyone at that time ever envision the iPhone? No. It would have been absolutely unimaginable. In fact, it would have been unimaginable a few years ago. The fact that you can store thousands of pictures and cruise the internet on your phone. Nobody predicted anything like that. Now, I'm not going to say that we don't predict at all. Jules Verne, for example, one of the great science fiction writers of all time, got a few things right. If you've ever read from The Journey from the Earth to the Moon, if you haven't, you should. It's one of the great classics. Well, pretty interesting. Because his idea was that man's first journey to the moon would be inside a very large bullet that would be fired from a cannon that was dug into the ground. But he kind of had the geography right, because he located his cannon very close to where Cape Canaveral is today. And when you look at the preparations that were undertaken for the loading of that cannonball with 3 people in it, very much like the 3 astronauts who eventually went on the Apollo missions, it's very similar to what the actual Saturn V rocket looked like. So he was a visionary. Of course, the technology was all wrong. This was not a rocket, it was a bullet shot out of a cannon. But he got some of it right. And when they returned to the Earth, they actually splashed down in the ocean, exactly the way that the Apollo astronauts did. So we may not be great at predicting the future based on science, but there are some smidgens of evidence that there are visionaries who have a pretty good glimpse of the future. But of course, the way to really get a handle on the future is to build it. Then we know where it is that we're going. And my background is in chemistry. And it is really chemistry that builds the world. Because everything, of course, is composed of chemicals. It's as simple as that. No matter what you look at, no matter what you touch, no matter what you see, what you smell, what you're looking at is generally a very complex collection of chemicals. So we build the world with these things. Now, unfortunately, the word chemistry very often brings fear to people. They get scared when they hear it. They think that it's complicated, that they can't do it. They recoil in horror at the very sight of a chemical formula. It's unfortunate. The word chemical has become associated with toxins, and books appear on our store's bookshelves with great regularity, telling us that modern chemistry is destroying our life, that we're polluting our nest, we're polluting our air, and that eventually the chemical industry is going to do us in. We are living in an age of chemophobia, irrational chemophobia. People don't know what to worry about, and generally worry about the wrong things. They think that chemists are a different breed altogether, and we very often are chastised because we, unleash various chemicals upon an unsuspecting public, and we become associated really with the work of the devil. The fact is that chemistry really should be in the limelight because it is the most fundamental of all sciences. It is the thread that ties all of the other sciences together. Because if you have a feel for what molecules can and cannot do, you develop a pretty good feel for what can and cannot happen in the world. Now, it used to be that chemistry flew high without any criticism. I remember going in 1964 to the New York World's Fair and the DuPont Pavilion, where they had a wonderful show that repeated many times during the day called Better Living Through Chemistry. In fact, this was the DuPont company's slogan, one of the largest chemical companies in the world. No one at that time thought that there was any problem with that expression. There was never any negativity attached to chemicals. This was at the height of the space race between the Soviets and the Americans. Science and technology were flying high. And things have changed. Today, people talk about pollution, they talk about pesticides, they talk about bisphenol A in the food supply, they talk about phthalates leaching out of their plastics, and all of a sudden, the term chemical has turned into a dirty word. Now, to be realistic, none of us in the chemical world are naive enough to think that there are no skeletons in our closets. There are. Without a doubt, there have been many mistakes made in the past, not intentionally, just due to a lack of knowledge. And today, we have much better abilities to know what is toxic and what is not, what we should be doing and what we should not. But hindsight is always easy. Now, if you look back, kind of things that we worried about 60, 70 years ago, we worried about cholera and dysentery and typhoid. These diseases have been essentially wiped out. Why? Because we chlorinate water. The greatest technological advance in the history of the world. So we had problems, we solved it. Well, the chlorination of water does introduce some other problems of its own. When you chlorinate water, you form compounds in there called trihalomethanes, of which chloroform is an example, which are potentially toxic. But of course, that worry is a much smaller worry than worries about cholera and dysentery and typhoid. So today, we kind of have the luxury of worrying about more and more trivial things because we have solved some of the bigger problems. Now, when we look back with our current state of knowledge, we can say, yes, well, we should have done this and this and that back then. But that's just because we have a lot more knowledge now. No one could have ever predicted back in the 1930s when freons were introduced as a novel refrigerant to replace ammonia and hydrogen sulfide, which were used in all refrigeration systems. And at that time, the introduction of freons or chlorofluorocarbons into refrigeration air conditioning systems was a wonder because ammonia and hydrogen sulfide were toxic. If you had a leak from your fridge in the kitchen, it could kill you. Well, freons were introduced to solve all of that problem. Who could have ever predicted that in 50 years' time, those chemicals might find their way into the upper atmosphere and interfere with the ozone layer and cause the so-called ozone hole, which would allow more ultraviolet light to get through and increase the incidence of skin cancer. Not something that is predictable. Of course, in hindsight, you could say, yes, we should have done this or that. That's just because we have a lot more knowledge today. The fact is that there are no good or bad chemicals. There are only safe or dangerous ways to use chemicals. Morphine, a wonderful painkiller. Someone has terminal cancer. Morphine is an absolute godsend because it relieves their pain. But morphine is also a social scourge. Addiction to morphine is probably the biggest sociological problem we have in North America. But it's not morphine that decides whether it's going to be mainlined into a druggie or to be used in a hospital to treat a cancer patient. It's people who make those kinds of decisions. But we are constantly confronted by the notion that all chemicals essentially are the wolves in sheep's clothing and that eventually their evil nature will be revealed. This is what the activists tell us. That chemists are uncaring people who put additives into our food that trigger cancer in the population and that they are not to be trusted. This is what we face. But let me give you an interesting little example of just how this comes about. An article in Time magazine. Now, Time magazine, I think will agree, is a pretty sophisticated and reputable magazine. Article in there about eating organic, eating local, which is great. I push this all the time. I think we should be eating more and more fruits and vegetables. I like to lecture on the benefits of eating these things. So I was kind of eagerly reading that article until I come to a point in the article where just was stopped dead with a quote from Dr. Joan Gusseau, who happens to be a professor of nutrition education at Columbia University, which is a high-class university. Not quite the stature of McGill, but that's okay. We actually beat them in the last rankings. We came in 17. This just came out last week. We came out number 17 in the world out of something like 6,000 ranked universities. And Columbia was, I think, 21st or 22nd. But anyway, that doesn't give her the excuse to make comments like this. For butter versus margarine, I trust cows more than chemists. I can imagine why that kind of comment stopped me. Because I've never thought that cows were the ultimate font of wisdom. I thought that we chemists could compete with them on the intellectual in fact, to our advantage. Well, of course, what my pal Dr. Gusseau was worried about was margarine, and more specifically, the fats in margarine, and you probably heard this dirty word, the trans fats. The trans fats come about because there is some chemical manipulation that goes on. You take vegetable oils, you pass hydrogen gas into it in order to make a solid fat, but there are side products that form, and those are the classic trans fats. And indeed, we try to avoid those trans fats because they have been linked with increasing the levels of cholesterol in our bloodstream, and that in turn has been linked, of course, with heart disease. So it is a very legitimate kind of a concern. However, of course, it was the work of chemists that discovered the presence of trans fats, and it was also chemistry that solved the problem. Because today, we have products like margarine and others, which are trans fat free because we know how to produce them without trans fats, thanks to our chemical knowledge about molecular interactions. We can avoid this problem. So, Dr. Gusseau's reliance on cows is not scientific.